In 1984, there was no sound more iconic than the high-pitched scream of a supersonic helicopter tearing through the canyons of the American West. And there was no face more perfect than the man behind the stick. His name was Jan-Michael Vincent. At that moment, he was the most expensive human being in the history of television. He was paid $200,000 per episode to play the brooding hero, Stringfellow Hawk. Adjusted for inflation in today's market, that is nearly $700,000 for 60 minutes of screen time. He was the golden boy, the natural heir to James Dean and Steve McQueen. He possessed the kind of effortless, rugged magnetism that made Hollywood executives tremble and audiences swoon. He didn't just have talent, he had lightning in a bottle. But there was a glitch in the machine, a detail so illogical it would eventually collapse a multi-million-dollar empire. Jan-Michael Vincent didn't actually want to be seen. Fast forward 30 years to a desolate parking lot in 2014. A passerby snaps a photo of a 70-year-old man in a wheelchair. One leg is missing, amputated at the knee. His face is a roadmap of scars, his eyes hollowed out by decades of trauma. This wasn't a movie set, this was his reality. When he finally breathed his last in a quiet hospital in 2019, the silence was deafening. There were no breaking news bulletins, no tributes at the Oscars. For over an entire month, the world didn't even realize he was gone. How does the most expensive man in the world become an unnoticeable ghost? This isn't just a biography of a downward spiral. This is a post-mortem of a fallen god, and the brutal, untold erasure of Jan-Michael Vincent. To understand the tragedy, we must first understand the magic. Jan-Michael Vincent was the recipient of a biological miracle. In the late 60 seconds and early 70 seconds, he possessed a look that Hollywood hadn't seen in decades. It wasn't just handsomeness, it was a quiet, dangerous calm. He was the all-American Adonis, the surfer boy with a soul that seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. In films like The Mechanic and Big Wednesday, he stood next to legends like Charles Bronson and didn't just hold his own, he stole the frame. He was what directors called the natural. He didn't seem to be acting. He was simply existing, and the camera was lucky enough to be there to witness it. Casting directors noted that you couldn't manufacture what Jan had. You could train an actor to cry, you could teach them to fight, but you couldn't teach them that gaze. His face became a commodity before he even had a chance to own it. To the public, he was invincible. He was the brother we wanted, the hero we cheered for. But behind those sapphire eyes, there was a restlessness, a profound discomfort with the very fame that was turning him into a god. He was a man who occupied the air around him, yet spent his life trying to take up no space at all. To understand the fall, we have to understand the silence. For Jan, being quiet wasn't a stylistic choice, it was a survival mechanism. Growing up under a regime of strict, unforgiving discipline, Jan learned early that emotions were a liability. In his household, words invited attention, and attention usually preceded pain. He moved through the world like a man trying to leave no footprints. Hollywood, in its infinite cynicism, mistook this deep-seated trauma for mystique. They marketed his emotional unavailability as cool defiance. They saw the armor, but they never bothered to look at the wounds underneath. Jan never wanted to be a star. He wanted to be a man. He hated the pretty boy label, feeling like a fraud in the Hollywood circus. Alcohol wasn't his vice, it was his translator. It was the only way he could dampen the noise of a world that demanded he be a hero, when all he wanted was to disappear. He began to use substances not to party, but to numb the reality of being Jan-Michael Vincent, 1984. The year everything changed. CBS was looking for a hit to compete with Knight Rider. They didn't just want a show about a high-tech helicopter. They wanted a protagonist who felt like a Greek hero in a flight suit. Jan-Michael Vincent was the only choice. As Stringfellow Hawk, Jan was the personification of the American loner. He was the man in the mountain, the pilot of the ultimate machine, playing the cello to eagles in the twilight. For the kids sitting on their living room carpets on Saturday nights, he was the epitome of cool. The money was staggering. $250,000 per week. He had the world at his feet. But the more the world screamed his name, the further he retreated into the fog. On the set of Airwolf, the tension was palpable. He was hitting his marks, but the golden boy was beginning to tarnish. He wasn't just drinking, he was drowning in the middle of a desert of his own making. He was the highest-paid pilot in history, and he hated the plane. Control is the most expensive thing in Hollywood, and Jan was losing his. By the third season of Airwolf, the rumors couldn't be contained anymore. The natural was beginning to look worn. His eyes were bloodshot. His lines were forgotten. The industry is remarkably forgiving of eccentricities as long as you remain profitable. But Jan was crossing a line. The $250,000 checks weren't helping him, they were isolating him. They provided him the resources to self-destruct in private, away from the help he so desperately needed. The accidents started happening. Car crashes, public brawls. These weren't just bad luck. They were a subconscious attempt to destroy the very thing Hollywood was selling: his face. Every scar was a protest. Every arrest was a signal that the pilot had left the cockpit. The hero was falling, and when the crash finally came, it wouldn't just destroy a TV show. It would destroy a human being. There is a cold, hard line in a studio's ledger. On one side, you are an asset. On the other, you are a liability. In 1986, the inevitable happened. The roar of the Airwolf engines was silenced. CBS had had enough. The costs were ballooning, and their lead actor had become uninsurable. In Hollywood, uninsurable is the death penalty. It means no studio will touch you, no agent will call you, and no publicist will protect you. Hollywood didn't have a meeting to fire him. They simply stopped acknowledging his existence. The protection of the system vanished overnight. He wasn't just a man out of work. He was a man being deleted from the system's memory. The phone stopped ringing, and the $250,000 checks were replaced by court summons and rehab bills. He had flown too close to the sun, and now he was beginning his long, agonizing descent into the shadows. Hollywood can walk away, but the body remembers every impact. August 1996, a lonely road in Mission Viejo, California. Jan-Michael Vincent veered off the road and slammed into a parked vehicle. This was the moment Jan truly died, even if his heart kept beating for another 23 years. He broke 3 vertebrae in his neck, coming within millimeters of total paralysis. But fate had one more cruel joke to play. During the emergency intubation performed to save his life, his vocal cords were permanently damaged. The voice of the hero, that calm, resonant baritone, was gone. From that day on, Jan spoke in a permanent, raspy whisper. The golden boy could no longer act. He could barely even communicate. He was now a ghost in his own skin, a man disconnected from his own legend. Entering the new millennium, Jan-Michael Vincent had effectively disappeared. He retreated to a small town, living in total obscurity. Imagine being a man who once commanded the attention of 20 million people, now struggling to remember the details of his own career through a haze of trauma. Then came 2012. The final brutal blow, an infection, exacerbated by years of neglected health, forced surgeons to give Jan a choice: his leg or his life. They amputated his right leg below the knee. The irony was unbearable. This was the man defined by flight, by the freedom of the sky and the power of the surf. Now, he was tethered to a wheelchair. He was no longer a hero. He was a survivor of a war against himself, and he was losing. The golden boy was being reclaimed by the earth, one piece at a time. On the 10th of February 2019, Jan-Michael Vincent's heart finally stopped in a quiet hospital in North Carolina. He was 74 years old. But here's the most chilling part of the story. The news didn't break for nearly a month. In the age of instant information, a man who was once an idol to millions was so thoroughly erased that his passing didn't even register as a blip on the digital radar. There were no grand tributes, no Hollywood funerals, just the quiet filing of a death certificate. He died as he lived in the silence he had spent his life building. He didn't die forgotten, he died unnoticed. And in Hollywood, that is the ultimate form of execution. The hawk had finally landed. But there was no one left at the helipad to greet him. Jan-Michael Vincent didn't fail Hollywood. He was processed by it. The industry never learned how to love anything that couldn't last forever, and Jan was always temporary. He gave them his youth, his face, and his sanity. In return, they gave him a lease on fame that expired the moment he broke. Fame isn't a reward, it's a high-interest loan. And the system always collects. But Jan-Michael Vincent's story isn't an isolated incident. He was just a precursor to a much darker pattern, because while Jan was disappearing into the shadows of the South, another icon was rising. A man who seemed even more invincible, even more perfect. A man who thought he was untouchable until the same industry decided he, too, was uninsurable. Would you like me to tell you about the tragedy of the man who tried to replace him, only to meet a fate even more disturbing? The file is open. Click the video on your screen to uncover the secret fate of the man they said could never fall, but who ended up in a tragedy that Hollywood is still trying to cover up to this day. Are you ready to see the truth?